This is Faith Ignited, the podcast where we put God back into history. Episode 19 of Tender Awe. Louis felt the warmth of the sun on his face. His satchel swung over his shoulder, and his worn boots scuffing against the dirt beneath his feet. Thoughts of home put an extra spring in his step as he anticipated their vacation from school. His younger brother walked in step beside him, his gangly teenage limbs taking the path with familiar ease. Auguste had been his inseparable friend and companion for as long as he could remember. Louis hardly had a memory where they'd been apart. He smiled, thinking about their boyish escapades about the countryside, and his mother's extraordinary patience when the boys brought back pet birds, rabbits, fish, and mice. Louis listened to the sweet sounds of the birds soaring over their heads, and the wind brushing against his skin. His eyes kept trailing to the towering snow-capped peaks in the distance, feeling that familiar pull to comprehend their mysteries. Since being in school, he understood even more fully the complexity of these things, the wonder of existence. He'd recently been able to make his first excursion to the Alps, and when night had descended, he'd watched a large storm gather below them, while on the summit it remained perfectly clear. Even after his companions had all gone to sleep, Louis had sat there alone, captivated by the forming of the dark clouds, releasing torrents of rain upon Lake Lucerne below. The brilliance of the lightning streaking across the sky had been breathtaking. He'd lingered until the clouds had at last drifted softly away, letting down the light of the moon and stars onto the lake and landscape. Louis didn't know that he'd ever seen greater beauty, truly the work of a master creator. As he and Auguste walked cheerfully down the road toward home, chatting about their studies and plans during vacation, they heard the approaching sounds of a carriage. Louis turned back to see the coach forming in the distance. It soon overtook them, and to their surprise, it slowed to a halt. The two boys watched as the door opened and the face of a finely dressed man appeared. He was the carriage's sole occupant, and he greeted them warmly, saying, "Might I offer you young men a ride somewhere?" Thrilled at the prospect of cutting short their long walk, Louis and Auguste eagerly agreed, and the man gestured for them to climb inside. After giving directions to their parents' parsonage, the boys settled back against the cushioned seats as the carriage began rolling again down the road. The man offered to share his lunch with the hungry boys, learning their names and inquiring after their situation. They informed him that they were both college students at the medical school in Zurich, to which the man began asking about their schooling and future plans. Louis, always eager to speak of his ambitions and ideas, happily told about his goal to become a man of letters and science. Louis's life in recent years had been a rigorous schedule full of lectures and studying, but his time in Zurich had opened up many doors for him. Professor Schins, chairman of natural history and philosophy, had especially taken to him, and had given Louis a key to his private library, a privilege that he felt indebted to the man for. Access to books was a luxury his parents could not afford, and Louis had spent many an hour locked away studying or copying books to read later. Auguste had even helped him copy some pages down, despite the fact that they applied much more directly to Louis's studies than his own. The man sitting opposite to them in the carriage listened with a pleasant and interested expression, allowing the boys to share what they were learning and what they wanted to accomplish. When the carriage pulled to a stop in front of the parsonage, the man expressed a desire to meet their parents, and Louis and Auguste gladly made the introductions. Their younger sister Cecilia also made an appearance, and after a pleasant exchange, the man waved goodbye to the family, leaving them to their happy reunion. Louis was always overjoyed to see his parents and sister again. They wrote to each other frequently, which helped to lessen the ache of separation, but he always missed them while he was away. His father smiled, and his mother got tears in her eyes as she embraced her boys. The time passed pleasantly, as it always did on their vacations, and some days after their arrival, Louis walked into his father's study and found him bent over a piece of paper in his hand, a look of distress on his face. Louis stopped short, suddenly concerned. "Father," he asked, "is everything all right?" His father ran a hand over his face, his gaze drifting up to meet Louis's. "Yes," he said, "everything is quite all right. I have just read a rather startling letter." He held it up for Louis to examine. "It comes from the man who transported you and your brother in his carriage." Louis lifted a brow at this. "He informs me that he is a gentleman of great wealth." Louis saw a look of pain cast a shadow over his father's features as he continued. "He was very impressed particularly with you, Louis, and he's expressed a desire to adopt you and pay for your education." Louis reeled back. "He says that he believes you to be a genius and wants to see your potential reached." The expression of agony on his father's face conveyed the internal battle that he was undergoing at receiving such an offer. His father was a mere minister and schoolteacher. They had always had to struggle and sacrifice to provide their sons with any education. They had already lost 4 children before finally having Louis, Auguste, and Cecilia. It would break their hearts to give away their son, even if it was for his benefit. But his father was willing to consider the possibility of giving Louis up if it meant being able to give him the resources to reach his full potential. 1,000 thoughts flew through Louis's head. If he were to be adopted, it was likely that he would never need or want for money again. Never have to scrimp and save to be as little a burden on his parents as possible. But even knowing this, there was no hesitation in his response. "I do not wish to be adopted," Louis said with finality. "I will be no one's boy but yours." The relief on his father's face was immediate. Louis knew that there was no amount of money in the world to compensate for the loss of his family, and he felt sure that he could still achieve his goals without sacrificing what he held most dear. God would make their means enough. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. This scripture sometimes leads people, even inside of Christianity, to believe that faith is something blind, or that religion is a crutch for the less intelligent or strong. Neither are true. Did you notice the words used to describe faith? Substance, evidence. Both refer to something tangible. In some translations, evidence can actually be translated as proof, and substance as conviction. Think about that. A detective sets out to collect evidence that will prove someone's guilt. Now, they don't witness the crime itself, but by taking a look at the crime scene, they often find evidence that will paint a picture of what took place. This eventually leads them to a conviction. And good detectives train their minds to be observant of these details that woven together can tell a compelling story. Take people as another example. Every person is merely a sum of experiences and habits that you don't personally witness, but their countenance and their behavior are the evidence of those things that you don't see. Faith is more scientific in its approach than people realize. We don't believe in God because we're blind, but rather because we can see. In this episode, we'll discuss a man still acknowledged even by current researchers as the greatest natural scientist of his day. He was the first to discover the Ice Age, and was a renowned teacher and researcher who rubbed shoulders with not only many of the greatest minds of his time, but with kings and presidents as well. His name was Louis Agassiz. Charles Darwin, a contemporary of Agassiz, whom the world is much more familiar with today, once remarked to the famous poet Henry Longfellow, "What set of men you have in Cambridge? Why, there is Agassiz. He counts for 3. Darwin knew well of what he spoke, because it was Agassiz's work on entomology that Darwin would use to create his Origin of Species. So how did a man of Agassiz's scholarship and impact become removed from our history books, while Darwin has remained? I assert that it's because he refused to go where Darwin did with his conclusions. Agassiz always believed that nature was the result of divine thought. Now, in this episode, I'm not going to try and dismantle the theory of evolution by addressing all of the arguments. I am simply going to tell you what Louis Agassiz believed about the issue. And considering that his research was used by Darwin, I would say that his opinion is a pertinent one. My real intention with this episode is to show you the destructive toll that espousing Darwinism has had on religion and humanity in general. And I think that you'll be shocked by what I've discovered. But first, to give you some background on who Louis Agassiz actually is, because you're probably not familiar with him. Louis Agassiz was born May 28th in 1807 in Montier, Switzerland, nestled at the foot of the Bernese Alps. His ancestors were French Huguenots who fled from France during the persecution of Protestants under the reign of King Louis XIV. He descended from 5 generations of clergymen on his father's side, and his mother was the daughter of a physician. This was truly an appropriate blend for the bringing forth of a young man who would be a champion of the sciences as well as the spiritual. And until Louis was 10 years old, his parents were his only teachers. Not that that hindered him in the least. His mother was an educated woman who taught her children to love to read, and his father taught school alongside his clerical responsibilities. Together, they encouraged their children to love learning and discovery. Louis was especially close to his mother. Author Vicki Anderson described their relationship this way. His mother lost her first 4 children in infancy. Perhaps it was for this reason that she was so close to Louis. She understood his love of nature and all living things. She recognized he had intellectual tendencies, and more than a child's normal delight with animals. It appears that early in his life, she had been granted an understanding of the great work that he was destined to do. This knowledge gave her the position of being his most intimate friend even up to the last hours of her life. It may be partly because of this relationship that Agassiz always maintained such a high view of women. He even based his PhD thesis on the idea that, quote, women being historically the later creation was an improvement upon man. He was a strong believer in women being educated. In fact, he and his wife would together form a boarding school for women that would eventually become the famous Radcliffe University. And Elizabeth Agassiz wrote, Louis's love of natural history showed itself almost from infancy. When a very little fellow, he had beside his collection of fishes all sorts of pets, birds, field mice, hares, rabbits, guinea pigs, etc., whose families he reared with the greatest care. Agassiz's parents patiently indulged their son's curiosity, recognizing his interest in the world around him as a sign of his great intelligence. When he was 10 years old, Agassiz left to attend a boarding school that was about 20 miles away from his home, and his brother joined him there a year later. The boys were close enough for frequent visits home during their vacations, a journey that they typically made on foot. The Agassiz family had modest means, and made great sacrifices to educate their children. Louis recognized the burden this was for his parents and was determined not to waste his time or their money. So he spent long days studying, and even in his free time he was analyzing species of fish or having long discussions with his friends debating the problems of the universe. He wrote to his parents assuring them that at all events I shall restrict myself to what is absolutely necessary, and do my best to economize. He went on to college at age 17 at the medical school of Zurich. It was while he was there that he had what might have been a life-altering experience. He and his brother were making the journey home when they were overtaken by a carriage, and a gentleman offered them a ride. After sharing his lunch and asking the boys about their studies, he was so impressed with Louis that he later wrote to his father offering to adopt him. This was a matter of great anxiety for his parents because, of course, they wanted their children to have every opportunity possible, and they knew that a man with means like that could open up doors that they could never dream of. But Louis told them that he had no interest in that, and the matter was quickly dropped. This might seem like a simple thing, but the fact that a stranger in the span of a carriage ride was so convinced of Louis's potential that he wanted to adopt him tells you a lot about who he was. But what tells us even more was the loyalty and love that he felt for his family. In studying for this episode, I had the opportunity to read many of the letters that the family wrote back and forth during Louis's education, and I was so impressed by the incredible love and respect that existed in that family. One example was the fact that Louis had no interest in studying medicine, but he attended and graduated from medical school because his parents wanted him to have a stable degree that would secure his future. So he did. His father wrote to him saying, "Let the sciences be the balloon in which you prepare to travel through higher regions, but let medicine and surgery be your parachutes." Louis listened to his father's counsel and followed through with obtaining his degree. And after his examination, the dean said to him, "The faculty have been very much, with emphasis, pleased with your answers. They congratulate themselves on being able to give the diploma to a young man who has already acquired so honorable a reputation." And upon hearing of his graduation, his mother wrote saying, "I cannot thank you enough, my dear Louis, for the happiness you have given me in completing your medical examinations, and thus securing for yourself a career as safe as it is honorable. It is a laurel added to those you have already won, in my eyes the most precious of all. You have for my sake gone through a long and arduous task. Were it in my power, I would gladly reward you, but I cannot even say that I love you the more for it, because that is impossible. My anxious solicitude for your future is proof of my ardent affection for you. May God reward you by giving you all possible success in the care of your fellow beings." And I want to just include one more thing, because his mother had another concern that she addressed with him that really shows you what she prioritized and what mattered to her. She wrote, "Nor are you made to live alone, my child. In a home only is true happiness to be found. There you can settle yourself to your liking. The sooner you have finished your studies, the sooner you can put up your tent, catch your blue butterfly, and metamorphose her into a loving housewife. Of course, you will not gather roses without thorns. Life consists of pain and pleasures everywhere. To do all the good you can to your fellow beings, to have a pure conscience, to gain an honorable livelihood and procure for yourself by work a little ease, to make those around you happy. That is true happiness. All the rest are but mere accessories and chimeras." And Louis's response to this is really sweet. He says, "You know well to whom you speak, dear mother, and how you must bait your hook in order that the fish may rise. When you paint it, I see nothing above domestic happiness, and am convinced that the height of felicity is to be found in the bosom of your family, surrounded by little marmots to love and caress you. I hope, too, to enjoy this happiness in time." And he would. Agassiz would marry twice, both times to extraordinary and talented women, who would play critical parts in helping him fulfill his mission in life. After medical school in Zurich, he went on to study at Heidelberg, and then at the University of Munich, where he received his master's degree. Everywhere he went, he found teachers who molded, taught, and inspired him. But when it came to pursuing knowledge, he also had help from a higher source. Louis's eyes squinted as he once again pored over the impression of a fossil fish etched in the stone slab in front of him. Finally, he leaned back, letting out a sigh of exasperation. He'd spent 2 weeks trying to decipher this particular specimen, but as of yet, he'd been unable to classify it. Weary and confused, he finally rose to his feet, trying to push the matter out of his mind. Since coming to Paris, he'd regularly put in 15-hour days, sometimes skipping meals just to get by. His small apartment was right across from the Center of Natural History for Europe, very convenient considering the amount of time that he spent there. The headmaster Georges Cuvier had proved an extraordinary mentor to Louis since his arrival. Louis's real wish was that he would have his help in preparing a book on fossilized fishes. Cuvier had created the animal classification system into 4 branches, based on their anatomical structure. And this classification system seemed greater confirmation in Louis' estimation of the reflective mind behind creation. God used patterns, and they always existed simultaneously. As Louis made the short walk back to his apartment, the city lights glowed all around him, and he again tried not to become discouraged with the current specimen that he was working on. Exhausted, he climbed into bed, staring up at the ceiling before sleep overtook him. As his mind was released from consciousness, he saw the shape of a fossilized fish, indeed the fossilized fish that had been so perplexing him the past weeks. But he wasn't just seeing the partially revealed shapes, but the fossil in its entirety, with its missing features perfectly restored. His eyes opened as reality seeped into his awareness. Brow creasing, Louis rose up and got dressed. He tried to keep the image fastened in his mind, but it soon faded. Still determined, he strode across the street to the center of natural history to take another look at the stone slab. He hoped that as he sat down to analyze it, the image that he'd seen in the dream might come back with vividness. But alas, it was nothing but a blurred record now. Disappointed, Louis once again went to bed that night with no further answers in regard to his specimen. Then, as he slept, the image of the fish reappeared as clearly as before. But as he got up, the image again became blurry in his memory. But as he got ready for bed that night, in anticipation of the dream again repeating, he placed a pencil and paper beside his bed before climbing beneath the covers. As his mind again became submerged in dreams, he saw his vision once more. It was hard to make out at first, but at last the image sharpened with such distinctness that he no longer had any doubt as to its zoological characteristics. Still half dreaming, and in total darkness, his hand reached for the pencil. Without the aid of light, he traced the characters onto the sheet of paper before going back to sleep. When morning came, he rolled onto his side to inspect his nocturnal artwork. He was stunned by what he saw. The features were not only not what he expected, but in his mind seemed an impossibility for the fossil to reveal. Anxiously, he hurried back to the center of national history, sketch in hand. Using the drawing as a guide, he began chiseling away at the surface of the stone. Bit by bit, the fish began to be revealed. Finally, Louis sat back, staring at it now fully exposed. It corresponded perfectly with the sketch from his dream. Gazing at it in wonder, he knew that something extraordinary had just taken place. This discovery made by Agassiz disclosed a fossil that was hitherto unknown, and led to the modern science of ichthyology. You see, this is what set Agassiz apart from other scientists. His faith was a great advantage because it gave him access to knowledge and understanding that was greater than his own. And this is very characteristic of Agassiz, who considered the pursuit of scientific knowledge as a sacred endeavor. Anderson stated it this way: even as a child, Agassiz felt that God's revelations of himself were not limited to the writings in the Bible. God also revealed himself through the book of nature. Agassiz considered himself to be the librarian of the works of God. He believed that, quote, in our study of natural objects, we are approaching the thoughts of the Creator, reading his conceptions, interpreting a system that is his and not our own. Indeed, Agassiz considered the study of science as a pursuit of translating the very thoughts of God. His mentor, Georges Cuvier, known as the father of paleontology and the world's leading expert on the anatomy of animals in his time, shared Agassiz's thoughts on this. He was a strong Christian himself, and believed that species were created by God and descended from their original pairs, not denying change over time, but change over species. And when he died, Agassiz became the champion of his beliefs. So here we have two of the most brilliant scientific minds in history that not only didn't laugh at the idea of creation being the work of God, but believed it to be self-evident and science-based. Agassiz was also the first to theorize that the Earth had at one period been covered in ice, which earned him the recognition in our history books as the father of the Ice Age. But truly one of the greatest impacts he would make on the world would come in his role as a teacher. After studying in Paris, he turned down other opportunities and took a professorship at the University of Neuchâtel, where he transformed the school into one of the great centers of science in Europe. Agassiz went on to secure the patronage of the King of Prussia, and was sent by him to America to study its zoology so that it could be compared to that of Europe. This was a huge turning point in the life of the great scientist. On this visit to America, he was immediately taken with the American way of life. His first lecture was delivered to a group of 1,500 people and was titled, "God's Planned Creation." He was deeply touched by the sight of people of all stations sitting side by side, in a place where all classes had an equal chance to receive education. When his wife Cecile died, he ended up remarrying, and he brought his family over to America. He decided to become an American citizen, despite the fact that America was quickly descending into the Civil War. And when people tried to persuade him to come back to Europe, he simply said, "I cannot. I love America too well." His coming to this part of the world was divinely timed, because before this, America had mainly been concentrating time and efforts to build up their nation, and they were just now beginning to focus on the increase of the arts and the sciences. And after Agassiz had read the scientific compilations that America had to offer, he found them to be, quote, "not of good execution." And so he made an unannounced visit to the President of the United States, who was John Knox Polk, to help the government set some strict criteria for scientific works and publications. Anderson said, "Many of America's scientific advancements owe their progress to the groundwork Agassiz set, and his consistent demand for quality." The very next year, Agassiz became a professor of natural history at Harvard, and he personally helped to train the next generation in the sciences. His philosophy was, to look is to know. He introduced a new way of teaching. His winter curriculum was confined to the indoors, but his summer curriculum was always outside. He would take his students for hikes, continually pointing out to them the marvelous works of God as they walked with no textbook. He said, "If you study nature in books, when you go out of doors, you cannot find her." One of his students, Clara Connet Gilson, described Agassiz this way, quote, "His eyes would moisten with tears of emotion as thoughts of his Creator came rushing to mind, while he traced his, the Creator's, footsteps in the science he studied. His eyes mirrored his soul. I think there never was but one pair of eyes such as Professor Louis Agassiz." And Anderson said, "He was easily moved to tears or laughter, and made no attempt to hide his feelings." David Starr Jordan, who was for a time a pupil of Agassiz, said that he was, quote, "the best friend that ever student had, because the most genial and kind. Cambridge people used to say that one had less need of an overcoat in passing Agassiz's house than any other in that city." Jordan also wrote, "Of the older teachers of biology in America, the men who were born between 1830 and 1850, nearly all who have reached eminence, have been at one time or another pupils of Agassiz." Agassiz was also instrumental in helping to found the Natural History Museum in the Smithsonian Institute. But above all else, he was a teacher that made an indelible imprint on the lives of so many. John's hand clung to the edge of the tugboat as the shoreline of New Bedford, Massachusetts faded into the background. The early morning wind sprayed sea foam in his face as the boat sliced through the waves. Penikese Island looked like a speck on the horizon. It was the smallest of the 8 little islands off the heel of Cape Cod. Many of the passengers chatted in eager anticipation of what lay ahead of them. They 50, 30 men and 20 women, had been chosen for this scientific camp meeting out of hundreds of applicants, hand-picked by Professor Louis Agassiz himself. The concept of summer courses on an uninhabited island was thrilling in a way, and none of them knew entirely what to expect. They traveled from all parts of the United States to take part in this, all coming from various backgrounds, some professors, others simply naturalist students. John himself was a poet, and had spent the better part of his life using writing to persuade against the evils of slavery, and he, like the rest, was eager to see what lay in store. As the tugboat landed in the little harbor, a tall, robust figure, bending somewhat from age, watched them, his large round face beaming with pleasure. He had kindly dark brown eyes and a cheery smile that greeted them. His enthusiasm was infectious. He warmly greeted them all, looking into the faces of those he'd made choice of among so many applicants. A farmhouse could be seen in the distance, as well as a flagstaff, barn, willow tree, and a flock of sheep. Their first impression of the place where they were to spend the next several months was somewhat shocking. The old barn had been hastily converted into a dining hall and lecture room. A new floor had been put in, but the doors and walls remained unchanged, and swallows' nests could still be seen under the eaves. The animals had been removed, and the hay wagon had been replaced with 3 long tables, and to the right of them a movable chalkboard. The next day, as they finished the morning meal, Agassiz rose from his place at the head of one of the tables. As he began expounding on his purpose for gathering them all there, the swallows flew in and out of the building, ignorant that this place was no longer a barn, but a temple of learning. They nearly grazed the professor's shoulder as he spoke of the need of better education, how those needs could be met, and the result that might come to America from the training and consecration of those 50 teachers present. It was obvious to those in the gathering that this was no ordinary school, let alone some frivolous summer outing, but a mission and work of great importance. Agassiz spoke with such earnestness, and that religious feeling so characteristic of all his thoughts. For science was to him a form of God's truth that should not be trifled with. His words landed with great resonance upon the ears of his listeners. Indeed, John believed that the words could never be duplicated justly. As Agassiz arrived at the end of his remarks, he looked at them, saying, "I would not have any man to pray for me now," and encouraged each of them to say their own prayer in silence. He bent his head, as did the others present, as their thoughts ascended to God. John felt deeply moved by the entire scene. Even a master such as Agassiz knew to whom he turned for enlightenment, and by example taught all present to do the same. L.P. Hartley wrote, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." That's something that's easy to lose sight of when you study history. We often try to impose our 21st century views and political expectations on people who did not live with our understanding or circumstances. And I've found that a common practice of Satan when trying to remove God-fearing men and women from history is to highlight weaknesses in a person so as to eliminate their credibility. And he's done this with extraordinary success, mostly because people don't know history very well. Now, that being said, no one in history is perfect other than Jesus Christ. We all have flaws, things that we didn't see clearly, things that we wish we could do differently, which is why it's so easy for the devil to use this tactic. If you were to do just a casual search about Louis Agassiz online, the first results are going to be controversial views on race. Now, he was not in favor of slavery, but he did have theories about different races being of different intelligences based on the size of their skulls, which we know today to be totally unscientific, and that skin color is simply based on the level of melanin in someone's skin. So our differences don't go farther than skin deep. But that was not the prevailing idea among scientists or even the public altogether at that time. Remember that this is all surrounding the Civil War period. Now, was Louis Agassiz wrong? Yes, he was wrong. But modern scientists are trying to use this as the reason why we don't talk about Agassiz anymore. But that makes absolutely no sense. Because if that was the case, we would not be studying anything about Charles Darwin, let alone exalting him in our schools. The very book that makes Darwin famous, On the Origin of Species, is full of controversial views on race. Scientists now have developed the habit of dropping the last part of the title. We generally know it simply as On the Origin of Species, but the full title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Darwin would further develop his ideas in his lesser-known book, The Descent of Man, where he theorized that man, having evolved from apes, continued to evolve, with some races evolving farther than others, placing his white or Caucasian race at the very top, with the lower organisms at the bottom, which he called low, savage, and degraded. In fact, Stephen Jay Gould, an evolutionist himself, admitted, quote, "Biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859, but they increased by order of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory." And even more chilling is a quote that comes from Sir Arthur Keith, who was both a strong believer in evolution as well as scientific racism. He claimed that, quote, "The German Führer, Adolf Hitler, as I have consistently maintained, is an evolutionist. He has consciously sought to make the practice of Germany conform to the theory of evolution." Now, Keith is not condemning Hitler when he says this, because he believes the same things, but he is literally crediting the idea of the Aryan race and the justification for the genocide and mistreatment of the Jews as a result of evolutionary theory. So the point that I'm trying to make with this is that Agassiz's thoughts on creation have not been removed from the public sphere because of racist ideas. If that was truly the motivation, we would definitely not be talking about evolution. It's pretty apparent that the real reason he has been blackballed from the scientific community is because of his commitment to biblical ideas and the divinity of creation. Now, I know that this entire episode is a bit controversial in nature, but we need to understand how this simple shift away from God is affecting the way we see the world. More importantly, how it is affecting the youth who are being taught it. In 1860, after Darwin released his book On the Origin of Species, Agassiz put out an article that challenged his ideas. Let's keep in mind that this is coming from someone who is highly educated on the subject. He was considered the greatest naturalist of his day. Not Darwin, Agassiz. They were contemporaries. Now, I'm not going to get into the entire article. If you want to go read everything word for word, by all means, I encourage you to go do so. I'll include a link in the description. But just a few things. Agassiz believed evolution to be not just against his principles or his beliefs, but unscientifically sound. He says, had Mr. Darwin or his followers furnished a single fact to show the individual's change in the course of time, in such a manner as to produce at last species different from those known before, the state of the case might be different. But it stands recorded now as before, that the animals known to the ancients are still in existence, exhibiting to this day the characters they exhibited of old. He uses the shark family as an example of this, because even in the earliest Paleozoic fossil beds, you will still find sharks that closely resemble the ones we have today. So why is it that they have not evolved or changed? And then he also basically asks, if this is the case, why are there not a lot of in-between species? If A turned into C, what happened to B? But the biggest argument he makes is that nature's, quote, unmistakable evidence of thought corresponds to the mental operations that our own minds have. And so that makes it pretty apparent that we owe our existence to the working of intelligence. And Agassiz believed that no theory that overlooked that element could be true to nature. Even Darwin admitted to suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, a lot of big words in this, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. That was something that Agassiz and Darwin probably could have agreed on. But Agassiz could never bring himself to believe that something as complex and beautiful as the world on which we live could have come about by accident. And he sums it up with this: I shall therefore consider the transmutation theory as a scientific mistake, untrue in its facts, unscientific in its method, and mischievous in its tendency. Now, there are a lot of other arguments I'm not going to get into because I'm no scientist, and this episode is not about trying to disprove scientifically evolution. I'm trying to show you how evolution has affected us today, how it has been mischievous in its nature. Because if there's one thing I know about the enemy, it's that Satan does things in a very calculated way. Do you think it's an accident that evolution just happens to remove God completely from creation? Now, I know there are some people who are strong Christians and believe that God may have used evolution to create the world. But that's not what Agassiz believed. In fact, evolution by its very nature is independent of God. That's why atheists gravitate so much to this theory. And I would assert that evolutionary theory has done more to destroy faith in our modern world than just about any other philosophy. Why? Because it completely removes accountability. It destroys divine identity. Children are being raised hearing that they are not created in the image of God for a great purpose, but rather in the image of an ape. And then we wonder why they're so confused about who they are and surrender to their basest instincts. But life does have a purpose. It does have meaning. And we have a God that not only planned the creation of this world, but its redemption as well. John Greenleaf Whittier was a student at the summer school that Agassiz created on Penikese Island. This had never been done before, and it only happened once, because Agassiz died just a few months later. Up until the very last part of his life, he was continuing to teach. Not just about science, but his love of God. And while he was there, Whittier witnessed Agassiz's humble act of silent prayer that began their summer of discovery. Whittier captured this epic moment of faith and science coming together, and he called the poem The Prayer of Agassiz. I want to read you just a few lines from it, because I think they capture the essence of everything we've talked about in this episode. Said the master to the youth, "We have come in search of truth, trying with uncertain key door by door of mystery. As with fingers of the blind, we are groping here to find what the hieroglyphs mean of the unseen in the seen. On the threshold of our task, let us light and guidance ask. Let us pause in silent prayer." Then the master in his place bowed his head a little space. Even the careless heart was moved, and the doubting gave assent, with a gesture reverent, to the master well-beloved. Through its veil of tender awe, how his face was still uplit by the old sweet look of it, hopeful, trustful, full of cheer, and the love that casts out fear. I am dumbfounded by the pride that has infiltrated our scientific community. It's as if the humble awe of God's creations seems to have died with the great Agassiz. I mean, who's to say that resurrection is impossible when we can't even fully explain how a seed can bring forth life? Is resurrection really more miraculous than birth? Is Christ restoring the sight of the blind really more miraculous than the fact that we can see it all? Everything is a miracle, and everything is a witness of the Creator. Many struggle with faith in this generation. I would give the advice that Agassiz constantly extended to his students, which is, to look is to know. If you will look for God, and have eyes to see and ears to hear, you will find, like Agassiz, that his creations are a witness of him. And as you continue to gather evidence, that feeling will grow into conviction, and it will ignite your faith. If you felt impacted by this episode, please like, share, and subscribe so that the fire of faith can continue to spread.